It's time to listen to our researchers from a scientific point of view, and I will now present our panel for you. Matti Pesu is leading researcher at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs. I think you have had a busy year so far, and it's not over yet. Eoin McNamara, Ph.D., who is a researcher at the University of Tartu, Estonia, but your background is Irish, indeed. University College of Dublin, and you have also worked for the Finnish Institute for International Affairs. Dr. Ann-Sofie Dahl, Associate Professor in International Relations, non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic College, living and working in Copenhagen. That's right. And Dr. Kristi Raik, who is director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, also worked at the Finnish FIIA and the Council of European Union in Brussels. Welcome to all of you, and I've asked you to start with a presentation for some minutes. I think we talked about 5 minutes or something, and after your presentations there will be some prepared questions, and then of course also possibilities for the audience to put a couple of questions within the framework of the time we have to spend, and that's about 60 minutes. So now the floor is yours, and starting with Matti Pesu.
Thank you, Stefan. Good afternoon, distinguished audience, dear colleagues. A pleasure to take part in the panel discussion. In my brief remarks, I'll touch on the role of defense cooperation in a context in which all Nordic countries are NATO members. I'll also address the potentially emerging division of labor in Northern European security, especially Nordic security. And then lastly, I'll zoom in on bilateral cooperation between Finland and Sweden, pondering how eventual NATO membership may affect the nature of that form of collaboration. But first, let me start with the broader question on defense cooperation. So there will be a need for defense cooperation between Northern European states or allies, even when Finland and Sweden join NATO. And this applies to Nordic countries, but also the Nordic Baltic countries more broadly. However, and this comes from a Finnish perspective, the logic of defense cooperation will somewhat change when Finland and Sweden join NATO. What I mean is that the NATO becomes the primary framework for enhancing deterrence and making preparations for joint defense operations, and non-NATO defense cooperation will become complementary to the NATO efforts. And again, from a Finnish point of view, the role of defense cooperation then will boil down to two additional objectives. First, its aim is to make the implementation of NATO collective defense more efficient in this region. I mean, it's essentially cooperation between states that have a significant stake in regional security. And secondly, defense cooperation will generate alternatives for operating jointly in a crisis or conflict if NATO, for some reason, works slowly, or if its decision maker for some reason freezes. Secondly, Finnish and Swedish NATO accession will allow a more distinct division of labor in Nordic security if the states consider it to be in their interest. Interestingly, as NATO allies, Finland and Sweden, for example, will not be identical twins. Finland will be a frontline state, protecting significant parts of Sweden and Norway, and this means that Finland's defense will probably remain rather land-heavy with significant air elements so far, and the Norwegians then will keep probably focusing primarily on the northern sea areas, northern Norway. Sweden, again, won't be in the front line. And as some commentators, such as Karlis Neretnieks, who's here in the audience, have argued that NATO membership may change the Swedish role, because as a non-frontline state, it can to a significant extent become a hub or springboard for allied operations in Northern Europe, offering direct and indirect support for more exposed states in the front line. And then thirdly, and lastly, Finnish and Swedish NATO memberships will not, in my view, radically change the nature and the substance of their bilateral cooperation, given the fact that it's already so deep. So Finnish and Swedish accession will have a more profound impact on cooperation with NATO allies such as Norway and the US, for example. But that said, now Finland and Sweden will become treaty allies, and this is new. So far, their cooperation has been non-treaty based on shared interest. In NATO, they will be militarily allied, having a strong political commitment to assist each other in a war. So thus, Swedish wartime cooperation becomes even more likely than before if a conflict erupts. And this will bring more, I'd say, predictability to the bilateral relationship. Second, NATO membership will likely offer new cooperation avenues, as both Minister Jonsson and Secretary General Esa Pulkkinen pointed out. It is, however, more likely that those issues like command elements would not be bilateral but broader, involving other Nordic countries as well, most notably Norway. And then finally, Finland and Sweden must place their bilateral cooperation in a broader context. In other words, activities like bilateral operational planning will remain necessary, but those elements must be aligned with broader alliance efforts. So just to summarize, first, defense cooperation will be needed. Second, a clear division of labor in Nordic defense may emerge. And then thirdly, NATO membership won't radically change Finnish-Swedish defense cooperation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Matti. And now I give the floor to Mr. McNamara.
Hey, can you hear me? No? This mic is out. No, it's good. It's good. It takes a little bit of time to warm up. Okay. So thanks, Matti. Some great points there. So I suppose my 5 minutes, I'd like to take you on a journey, kind of south and east, and then we'll go out west, back towards where I'm from, back towards Ireland and the maritime zone in the North Atlantic. And first, we'll start with where I live, and that's in the Baltic states currently. So NATO membership, impending NATO membership for Finland and Sweden is, of course, good news for the Baltic states for many different reasons. One reason crucial, something that's vital, but we don't give enough attention to, is logistics, military logistics and supply chains. That, of course, the supply chains feeding NATO's mobilization, feeding the enhanced forward presence. Mobilization from west to east. One of these supply chains is land-based, through Germany, Poland, up through the Suwałki Gap and into the Baltic states. And one is amphibious, through the Baltic Sea. And of course, the big question mark there was, if we needed to accommodate these supply chains further north, would we have Finnish and Swedish cooperation for that? As Finland and Sweden were NATO enhanced forward partners, we probably would have had, I would predict. It's a moot point right now. But of course, having Finland and Sweden inside the alliance, having Finland and Sweden deeply embedded in NATO's defense planning and policy structures, having them in the room all the time, constructively engaging, developing this, is another advantage, is another feather in the cap, so to say, of defense in Northern Europe. We've, of course, in strategic space close to Finland and Sweden, we've of course seen the eastern flank has been transformed, and logistics have been transformed by the war in Ukraine. and very, very positively so. We've seen how NATO allies can move equipment, can get equipment through Poland. Poland has been a key framework nation, if you will, in that regard, in this mobilization structure. And that bodes very, very well for the defense of the eastern flank and the northeastern flank in the future, because mobilization, should these forces be required in a contingency, is what NATO's defense and deterrence rests on. So military logistics are key, and Finland and Sweden's entry into NATO will galvanize this further. I've lived in Estonia for many years now. I might be coming towards the dusk in my time there, who knows. Sometimes they might say I'm a bit critical. I can be a bit critical, very high standards, sometimes on myself, and it blows up in my face. But I do have great respect for Estonia. I've very much enjoyed living there. And we must, of course, when we think of Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, we must give Estonians credit, because they kept the flag burning for total defense, or what is sometimes more frequently called in Finland comprehensive societal security. This mobilization structure, they kept the flag burning, or flame burning, for that when it wasn't a popular idea in London or in Washington or at HQ in Brussels. And they brought a lot of that knowledge into NATO. Incidentally, a lot of that knowledge was picked up from Finland during the 1990s, the Viro project, the Estonian project. I don't have time to get into that. So this contribution of Estonia, we've now kind of passed a new rubric on that total defense, comprehensive security, resilience will be strengthened further. And there's a very, very good platform to build this on now that Finland and Sweden joined the alliance. But that platform wouldn't be as strong were it not for the Estonians holding the torch all those years. So if we go further to the west, there is, of course, trouble, and we see the Arctic, the North Atlantic, maritime zone, and the Baltic Sea as one strategic operating theatre. There is trouble brewing in the North Atlantic. Undersea cables, that North Atlantic basin, 75% of the Northern Hemisphere's internet traffic flows through there. There's something like $10 trillion of financial transactions flowing through there per annum. So very, very valuable, very strategic zone. Most of the access points off Ireland's exclusive economic zone, off Norway's, off Iceland's, these are access points to the Arctic Sea route, and Russia wants to dominate there. They see this, the Arctic Sea route, big geopolitical game, and they must come out on top between NATO and China on the other hand. We've seen in recent years, 2019, 2020, 2021, British RAF have to scramble to intercept Russian Tu-95s and Tu-142s. What do Tu-95s and Tu-142s tell us? They're maritime patrol aircraft, which means very, very likely, if not definitely, their submarines are on the base of the sea conducting maneuvers close to these undersea cables that are so vital for Europe's connectivity. And so we need also, with Finland and Sweden now in NATO, we need also to look at that dimension. Nordic defense cooperation needs to focus more on that. And of course, framework nation, the United Kingdom is a key ally in that regard. We've mentioned the JEF, maybe some role for the JEF in a naval capacity, if it can be extended to that, is important. So just a word of caution. I do transatlantic relations, so my last point, moving further west towards Washington, fully across the Atlantic. I mean, Russia and its brutalization of Ukraine, its escalation in Ukraine, has changed the US focus. We don't hear pivot or rebalance anymore. There is a clear understanding in Washington that resources are required in Europe. This is clear. But let us not forget that China and the United States' response to China, that's what's primarily driving their force posture. Europe's important, but the Asian theater, the Asia-Pacific theater, is perhaps more so. And this was subtly underscored in the national defense strategy and the national security strategy that came out last month. So burden sharing is key. Europeans must have to do more, and for that, there's lots of cooperation, and that cooperation must start at home, must start in the Nordic-Baltic region, without making others jealous by creating a Nordic bloc within the alliance. But there's a lot of common objectives. There's a lot of operation similarities, and politically now, thanks to the war, everyone in the Nordic-Baltic region is on the same page, more so than at any time in the post-Cold War era. So it's carpe diem. We need to seize the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Coming back to you later. Now, Ann-Sofie Dahl, the floor is yours.
Is it on? Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Stefan, and thank you to everyone. Thanks for the invite, and it's always great to be back in Helsinki. I call myself an FOF, Friend of Finland. And apologies also to start for those of you who attended the book seminar yesterday. I actually did rewrite my notes for this because I thought people don't want to hear this again. But then I realized that it did make sense to apologies to Stefan, I heard this 3 times now. But not all of it will be new. So the original and the best. Well, first of all, I'm going to say some words about sort of how this enlargement fits with or compares with the previous ones, NATO's previous enlargements. But first of all, we might think of this as a long and frustrating process. Will it ever end? Will the ratifications ever come to an end? We only have 2 more to go now, but it feels like it's taking forever. But this has actually been an exceptionally fast process. And historically, it will be very fast, even if it drags on until the next year, which I don't think it will. But even if, it still will be historically fast. The 2 countries applied in May, were invited at the summit in Madrid at the end of June. And before that, the membership action plan took only a day, as we heard. And usually the map process by itself takes years, even decades. And I think that's what the Secretary General Stoltenberg and also the previous Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen talked about when they referred to they talked a lot about the fast track process. Remember in the spring that Sweden and Finland were sort of on a fast track towards membership in NATO. And I think what they referred to was really the map process. But it was confusing to some who did not have detailed information about how things work in NATO, because it gave the impression of, you apply today and tomorrow you are a member. And that is, of course, not how things happen in NATO. But this round is also exceptional and unique in also other ways. It wasn't supposed to happen. Prior to this spring, no one expected or anticipated Sweden and Finland to become members of NATO, or for an enlargement to take place anytime soon in NATO, including at NATO. And definitely not to Sweden and Finland. It wasn't in the cards. Both countries were perfectly happy as partners in this enhanced opportunities partnership group. So Putin's plan that he presented at the end of last year has certainly backfired in a big way. As you recall, he demanded a stop for NATO enlargement. Instead, he gets Sweden and Finland as new members. I mean, who would have thought? And of course, the Russian attack on Ukraine changed all that. And the realization, first in Finland and then more slowly in Sweden, that of the dire consequences of being outside, of not being protected by Article 5. And this also confirms the analysis in a book that I reviewed recently by Jason Davidson, and I quote, he says there, and I quote, "Lesser states seek alliances when their fundamental survival is at stake." And that's exactly it. And also, never before during the many rounds of NATO enlargement, and we have 3 during the Cold War, 5 after the Cold War, has NATO been able to welcome 2 new members with such a high level of military and political preparedness as Sweden and Finland. This is, of course, but first, two democracies, old Western democracies. NATO has never welcomed two old democracies before. And NATO is, of course, an alliance of democracies and for democracy. And also militarily, which is, two members which are very high level of, well, interoperability with NATO after so many years of PFP partnership since 1994. And I see Elisabeth Rehn here. I remember when you and Anders Björk were working on the PFP process many years ago. Many years ago, yes. But we have a high level of preparedness, we have a high level of interoperability, high-notch technologies, capabilities, and also a very sophisticated defense industry, of course. And both countries are known as reliable security providers or security producers. Over several rounds of military operations under NATO command, from Bosnia to ISAF, and both have also taken part, as we know, in innumerable NATO exercises in the Baltic Sea and elsewhere. And they have also both been referred to as NATO's partner number one. And in the Swedish case, that was after the Libya operation, the Swedish performance in the Libya operation, the Operation Unified Protector in 2011. So two highly qualified new members. But having said that, they are still newcomers to a club. And they're newcomers to a club where the oldest members have been members for now more than 73 years. The 12 original founders. And that calls for, as I see it, a dose of humility as they take their seats around this ever-expanding table at the NAC. Especially applies to, of course, this especially applies to Sweden, which is known for its high international profile. And now, I would say it's definitely the time to shelf the moral superpower. And then that step will, of course, be easier with the new government in Sweden. And also, as we talked about at the book presentation yesterday, there's a need for a new mindset after all these years of non-alignment. The realization that Sweden and Finland will now be part of NATO, will be integrated into NATO. We're going to be on the inside. NATO is not going to be somewhere else out there. It will be contributions not to NATO, but within NATO. Or as the hashtag, NATO's hashtag is at Twitter, we are NATO. And the focus should now, as I see it, be on the two C's, capabilities and contributions to the entire NATO area, the 360 degrees area or perspective, even though we feel, of course, a certain responsibility for our own region. And it will be, of course, a great impact here in the north with our memberships. The entire northern flank will be substantially strengthened in NATO, politically as well as militarily. And that might be why some countries in the south have been a little bit more sort of hesitant behind closed doors only. But let me conclude by quoting President Biden when he had put his signature to the US ratification of the Swedish and Finnish membership applications in August. And he said, and I quote, "When Finland and Sweden bring the number of allies to 32, we will be stronger than ever." Thank you.
Thank you, Ann-Sofie. And last but not least, Kristi Raik, please.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure. So much has been said already about Finland, Sweden, and NATO. I try to avoid repeating it and take a bit broader view on Nordic-Baltic security in the current situation. And although you used the word scientific in introducing us, let me start with a very personal observation. I spend a lot of time at the Baltic Sea in summertime, sailing between Estonia, Finland, and Sweden. And this summer was different. Namely, I have never seen so many warships at the Baltic Sea. And I think it was, of course, a sign of what kind of times we are living through, the deteriorated security environment. We haven't had as serious a situation ever since the end of the Second World War. But at the same time, it was also a sign of preparedness, kind of being awake and having also the allies present. And this is, of course, what needs to be done even more. The Finnish and Swedish, hopefully soon to become NATO accession, it will further strengthen the ability of the Nordic-Baltic region to actually cope with this deteriorated security situation that we have in Europe. But there is certainly no room for complacency or particular optimism. And one thing that I think Finland, Sweden and the Baltics with some other allies can bring together to the NATO discussions is a realistic view on Russia. Finland has been quite remarkable in always having a defense policy based on a realistic analysis of Russia, while not necessarily speaking out loud about its threat assessment. But in defense, the approach has been very, very clear. And today we are in the situation where, of course, we have all been shocked in Europe about this brutal war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. At the same time, we have been surprised that Russia is militarily weaker than we expected. It's not doing that well at all in waging this war. But we also see that in spite of the weaknesses, Russia is able to create massive damage, and we should not underestimate Russia's ability to keep the war going, and in future also to restore and rebuild the forces that it has now lost in Ukraine. So, of course, the assessment of the Russian threat has changed in NATO collectively. We see it very clearly in the NATO strategy adopted in Madrid, that the Russian threat and strengthening NATO's deterrence and defense vis-à-vis Russia is the top priority for the alliance. But I also see some signs of danger looking ahead, that some allies may tend to underestimate Russia because of this poor performance of the Russian forces that we have seen in Ukraine. And also, I think some allies tend to have overly positive expectations towards post-Putin Russia that will eventually come one day. We don't know when, but we should avoid having kind of optimistic expectations about Russia's possible democratization, or about Russia possibly giving up its imperialist attitude towards neighboring countries. Unfortunately, looking at the centuries-long history of Russia, the kind of imperialist view on neighboring countries, the idea that for Russia to be secure, it has to dominate its neighbors, it has been there for centuries. And also Russia has never been a stable, functioning democracy, in spite of some efforts to build democracy in the 1990s. So we need to keep this realistic assessment of what kind of Russia we might be dealing with in NATO in future, and then continue strengthening the defense capabilities in NATO accordingly. And there is a lot of work to be done there. I mean, many nice things have been said about the strengths and capabilities of Finland and Sweden, but we know, of course, that not all NATO allies have been taking defense as seriously in the past years. We have also heard many times today that NATO is a collective defense organization. So the capability of every ally matters. And finally, very shortly, more specific remarks on Nordic-Baltic relations in the context of NATO enlargement. We have seen Finland placing a lot of emphasis on Nordic cooperation in recent years in the context of the deteriorating security environment, and also in the context of the NATO accession process, a lot of talk about Nordic cooperation. Again, we've heard today that there are no blocks in NATO. That's not the concept NATO uses. But then the Baltic states often come as a kind of footnote or an afterthought to this Nordic cooperation. And this is one thing where change is in progress, I think, both practically and mentally. What does it mean that the Nordic-Baltic region is a strategic entity? I mean, why do we still hear this question raised in the Finnish and Swedish debate that does NATO membership mean that Finland and Sweden would have to take responsibility for defending the Baltic states? It does not make sense, of course, to anyone knowing how NATO operates, but we have heard it many, many times in the Finnish and Swedish discussions, and even kind of concerns expressed by Finnish commentators about Finland now getting too close to the Baltics, and references to the 1920s Reunavaltio politiikka, which was an attempt to build this close cooperation between the Finland, the Baltic states, and Poland, which failed. So all of this is just weird, thinking of the current context where the Nordic and Baltic countries will be all together in NATO, also most of the Nordic countries with all of the Baltic countries in the EU, and for the first time ever in history being part of the same defense alliance. So this is the idea that I think deserves somehow to be really internalized in the thinking in the Finnish and Swedish security and defense discussions, and that also then needs to be put into practice in the NATO framework. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristi. Thank you to all of you. A lot of food for thoughts there. Well, as we know, politics, world politics is kind of live broadcasting. And sometimes we might be able to analyze what's really happened only when some time have passed. And looking at the spring, and looking at the rapid change in the public opinion in Finland and Sweden in favor of NATO membership, going back to the roots of the process that started at that moment. From your point of view, we're surprised about the quick change in the public opinion, and it even seemed that the public opinion kind of led or even overrun the politicians rather than the other way around. Would you like to elaborate on this, Matti?
Yes, this is an excellent question, and the change in the public mood was indeed striking. For 25 years, the opinion was more or less stable, roughly 25%, max 30% were in favor of NATO membership, more than 50% against, and then suddenly within just few months we witnessed a complete turnaround. So that is significant, and I was personally surprised, because before the Russia's February invasion of Ukraine, I mean, we had war against Georgia and the 2014 invasion, and the needle in public opinion, so-called needle, it barely moved. It barely hardly affected Finnish public views. But now the invasion of it's more brutal and of very different magnitude than, still quite surprisingly, very profoundly affected the public mood. Was public opinion decisive in terms of Finland's NATO membership? I'd say yes and no. I mean, it's very hard to empirically show what the effect really was, and I think every Finn, just an ordinary layman or a politician, MP and minister, were reevaluating their views. But I'd say that without the change in public opinion, or had it been less significant, I'm not sure whether we would be traversing this path right now. I mean, the change could have been much slower, so the dramatic change definitely set the pace. That's my view.
Thanks. Because it seems that behind the 25%, somewhere there was a kind of latent, hidden, non-apparent readiness to rethink if there is a motive and if there is something surprising happening in our surroundings, and that's what's happened. Ann-Sofie.
Yes, and exactly that. I think that's a difference between Sweden and Finland. Many differences in this respect. The readiness to sort of reevaluate that you have in Finland. And the odd thing is, of course, that the numbers in Sweden were always higher. Pro-NATO numbers were always higher in Sweden, somewhere around 30 to 40%, even more at some points. But Finland really moved so much faster when things started to happen in the spring. I wish that we had. I mean, Sweden and Finland are also different. The reasons why we had our non-alignment and it's sort of the basis of our non-alignment. In Finland, security has been about security, or security policy has been about security. In Sweden, security policy has often been about domestic politics, and sometimes almost a religion with non-alignment. And this, right now, I think we have moved too fast. I wish we had been able to have this conversation in the 1990s, or even before that, but or earlier at least, so we could have prepared sort of the ground better in Sweden than we have, and that we could have analyzed things more, as we did in the EU process. There was a long period between applying or starting the process of applying and actually becoming members. And I think that we now see not a backlash, but there is some hesitation in some quarters and some question marks being raised, and I think that this is an effect of the fact that we have not had a solid debate about this. And the reason why we haven't had it, because it hasn't been accepted in Sweden. I mean, I and many here in the audience have tried to raise NATO, but it hasn't been. We haven't been able to do that, and we see sort of that is the backlash now, unfortunately.
Right, Kristi.
Certainly, the speed and depth of the change in Finland was quite amazing, and the previously held NATO option that Finland had in its strategy for many years, I think it was not very well understood anywhere outside Finland. Of course, there were different interpretations about it also in Finland. Then when this moment of dramatic change in European security came, it was actually not so clear whether this now means that Finland, assessing the changed security environment, will actually apply for NATO membership, but this was indeed the conclusion. And one thing that changed on the 24th of February was that this understanding about the importance of the fate of Ukraine for European security, it became recognized much more broadly beyond the Baltic states and Poland, that I think always had the understanding, and even after, well, of course, already in 2008 saw the importance of the Russia-Georgia war, and then in 2014 the impact of the annexation of Crimea by Russia. So it was the understanding of the Baltic states that Ukraine's fate was going to be crucial for our own security. But then I think after the 24th of February, Finns also started to think about Ukraine in the same way, that if this war ends badly for Ukraine, then Finland's own security will be in a dramatically worse place than before.
Right. I think some of you might have also experienced the fact that those who in the previous years said hold your horses about the NATO issue are at least partly the same persons who in the spring said that we have had no time to debate the thing. What goes round comes around.
Can I?
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, the one quote I remember on all this, looking as he looked into the cameras, you cause this, look at the mirror. A friend of mine, he works for FIIA, he's also from Ireland, but he works for the Finnish national broadcaster, and he talked about rally English as the Finnish vernacular in the second language often, or maybe third language, because of course Swedish language here as well. But that press conference was, of course, very revealing, and I think the Swedish defense minister also said the same thing. When did you realize that you were going to apply for NATO membership? The Swedish defense minister told us the last panel, said December 17th, I think was the date. And Sauli Niinistö in that press conference, I think the press conference was in April or May, I think it was when Johnson came here to offer his guarantee, that he said, you know, in December, when Lavrov came out with this idea that NATO not accept any new members, and they go back to 1997 borders, which is completely off the wall stuff, that now they are, you know, previously in the post-Cold War era, they offered Finland, you know, Finland and Sweden, they had their own will to be non-aligned. Matti would say they were never non-aligned, or they haven't been non-aligned for a long while, but let's use that term. But they closed off that will, which was, of course, stark violation of the Charter of Paris and of the Istanbul Accords, the Charter on European Security, and that really set the train in motion. And then we had the invasion, and people here are very, very well informed. I mean, coming from a British or an Irish background, going back 10 years, and my mysterious links with the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, one of the things that struck me first 10 years ago when I started coming to seminars and every now and again being invited to speak at seminars, was how Finland especially, people here, researchers here, were very, very conscious. Research is always geared towards kind of adapting to the world as it changes. We had Nokia technology, then Nokia phased out. Now there's a new model for the Finnish high-tech economy. Same with its security concept. And they're always thinking. The world changes every year, so always up to date, keeping things sharp. And there's a lot of that in public discourse as well. So when that fork in the road was reached, you know, between December last year and say April this year, public discourse was ready to change their mind and to adjust the sails and to understand that the world had changed and changed profoundly. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's bring in one or two questions. Then I think we might save some time for the Turkey issue. But let's just bring in one or two questions, please. Gabriele Baumann.
Yeah, thank you. Gabriele Baumann, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Germany. I have One question to Mr. McNamara, because of your Irish background. There are now 4 countries left in the European Union, I think it's 4, who are still non-aligned, neutral. So what do you think? When would Ireland actually think about joining the NATO?
I'm getting in a lot of trouble. I'm starting to write on this, and I'm getting a lot. I wrote an article on this actually. It's called "Evolving Neutrality" for the Royal United Services Institute in London. I wrote that during the summer. Irish public opinion is very different. I think Ann-Sofie said something. We're not as pragmatic as the Finns. We're more like the Swedes, where non-alignment or staying out is more. It's become a kind of idealized. You said like a religion. And people become very attached to it. But the thing I don't think Irish public opinion understands, we don't, I mean, working at FIIA, working at UPI, I often thought I'd see Charlie, I see Charlie Sloanis in the audience and Matti and Villa Sincon and all my friends, and they're out in the debate. I'm like, why aren't we doing this in Ireland? Why aren't experts more involved, kind of explaining the world as the world turns, so that public opinion can make its own decisions and respond to that? In Ireland, we haven't got there. We're still under this flawed notion that just because we pose no threat to others doesn't mean we won't be threatened ourselves. And we are being threatened. I mean, we've been shocked, and the government's very slow to admit it, on the undersea cables. We're now talking, you know, that the North Atlantic, after the Nord Stream 2 explosions, that the North Atlantic could be the next maritime battleground in this hybrid war between NATO and the West. And Ireland has huge responsibilities there through its exclusive economic zones. It doesn't have the capabilities, the independent capabilities, through its own poor investment, and it doesn't want to join an alliance. And the phrase I use to finish all this off, you fall between 2 stools. But it's very much like in Sweden previously, as Ann-Sofie said, very much guided by domestic politics rather than strategy, unfortunately.
Right. Please. Yeah. Yes. Press the button.
Pressing all the buttons.
The one that makes the red light go on.
Yeah, this was an obligation. It doesn't work.
Okay, you will get one from behind. That seems to work.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Chris Elving, I have a question for Ann-Sofie Dahl, based on what you said about Sweden. Being a Finn, sometimes we think that we perfectly understand what's going on in Sweden. Other times, we're not that sure. And basically, you said that the lack of debate about joining NATO has not been maybe as good or as big as it should have been. And my question is, do you think that would backfire in terms of not going all out with strengthening the Sweden's own defense, increasing conscription, etc., once Sweden has become a NATO member? Do you think there's a risk for that or no?
Thank you. Very good question. I don't think it will backfire in that respect. I think backfire is not really the word for the debate. It's more sort of some points that are being made now around, you know, the various steps that we'll take. Whether there will be any preconditions, or, you know, the nuclear issue has come up and things like that. So that's sort of where the debate is focused right now. But I have no doubt, as the defense minister said, Paul Johnson, that Sweden will go all the way, will be very active and committed ally, and a very committed and active ally when it becomes an ally. So I don't think this will backfire in a practical sense. And I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Since a question, Ambassador. A question to all the panelists. Let's see, at the same type of event in Helsinki a year ago, a 42.7 ESCP European defense would have been thrown around a lot. Haven't heard much about 42.7 European defense, ESDP, CFSP, and so forth in the last 8 months. What do you think, all of you, will be the effect of sea change in Finland, Sweden, and Denmark to the European defense and security efforts? Thank you.
Thank you. If you can be brief, please. Yeah, Matti.
Yeah, so indeed, Finland has been a strong advocate of EU defense and 42.7. Based on my discussions, there is at least among policymakers and officials, there is still an understanding that Finland should continue advocating EU defense. But I'm not sure whether there will be support from politicians and from the political field now when Finland becomes part of NATO. So briefly, I think the understanding of division of labor in Euro-Atlantic or European security becomes more clear, that the EU, its capability development, crisis management, and then NATO, that's collective defense.
Please.
I think the fact that Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership was the most clear acknowledgement you can get that the EU does not provide security guarantees. So when the situation became serious and the security concerns became serious, then the countries turned to NATO. It doesn't mean that they would abandon contributing actively to EU defense. And I would actually also question a bit this idea that let's keep EU defense only focused on some crisis management operations somewhere outside the EU. And of course, NATO is responsible for collective defense, that's obvious. But then I think there is also scope to take this idea of EU defense being complementary to NATO more seriously, in the sense that we should ask the question, so what does EU defense contribute to actually defending member states in a way that is complementary to NATO? So could the EU do more to support the development of capabilities that also NATO needs? This is one way to see the complementarity, and not to say that EU defense is only about these crisis management operations, which obviously have become less relevant in the broader security picture of Europe today.
Yeah, I think in the old days it was when there were some more political sensitivity, say in countries like Ireland, like Sweden, and Finland, that it was often a bridge. These EU defense pact. If the EU, everyone was inside the club, it was something familiar. Let's try and do defense stuff under the EU banner. And it kind of removed some of the controversies of having to do cooperation with NATO. But that seems to be melting now. It's supplementary. I think PESCO and PESCO's projects as well, something supplementary, good to have, but not really at the vital core. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'll leave that up to others to estimate. I think the EU, we need inside the EU, we need to think of more creative ways that we can build EU-NATO cooperation and improve European security. I think one way, I mean, the military Schengen. The EU is very, very good at funding transnational cross-border infrastructure, which is exactly what we need in a crisis. If we need to mobilize, if we need that mobilization fluency from west to east. So improving that infrastructure, bridges, roads, all that type of stuff, logistics, supply chains. I've heard Lieutenant General Ben Hodges talk about this. So thinking in more creative ways without duplication or without cooperating, where the EU can support and underpin NATO. So I think more creativity and creative thinking is now necessary, certainly on the EU side.
Thank you. Okay, right. We have about 5 minutes left. Let's talk about the elephant in the Finnish and Swedish living room, or maybe not the elephant because we have the midterm elections. Let's not interfere with them. But let's talk about, let's call a spade for a spade, the Turkish issue. it's quite obvious that the problem, the so-called problem, is not in Helsinki or Stockholm. The problem is somewhere else. So also the solution must be found somewhere else than here. But when, what is this Turkish issue all about, and what is it not about? Matti.
Yes, I think you rightly pointed out that most probably the Finland and Sweden aren't really the beef or the heart of the matter. I think Turks are genuinely concerned about the terrorism and the Kurdish question, no doubt about that. But I hardly think that Finland and Sweden somehow be grave national security threats to Turkey or the way how they approach the Kurds. So the real question must be elsewhere. I think there are two additional levels: the NATO level. So they have clearly sought attention and they have gotten attention. So their concerns, as far as I know, featured more prominently at the Madrid summit. And I think there's the third track, which is with the US, potential F-16 modernization and procurements. And there has been some progress regarding that as well now. So all in all, I think the window of opportunity is now open, especially with the new Swedish government, and I hope that it is used, or the Turks decide to use it now, because then the next opportunity may well be in the summer.
Ann-Sofie.
Yes, well, 2 points really. One is that we've seen Turkey do this before many times. This is something that has repeatedly, not specifically, of course, in these specific terms, but we've seen Turkey creating trouble in NATO many times by now. I mean, let me just refer to one situation when the former Secretary General Anders-Fogh Rasmussen was about to be appointed. He was at the summit where he was to be just sort of formally appointed, and everything was set, or at least that was what everybody thought, when Erdogan raised his hand and said, wait a minute, we can't accept this, sitting at the table at the summit. So that was even more dramatic than what we see now. And there was a bit of, well, certainly a bit of drama, very much drama, a little bit of crisis, and there was some negotiations, and Anders-Fogh had to, and by the way, that was also with reference to the Kurdish issue. He demanded that there's a Kurdish radio station in Denmark that Erdogan demanded be closed down, which of course didn't happen. But it was also, he also had references to the Danish Mohammed crisis, as you might remember. So what happened was that there was a lot of negotiations and drama, and they got, I think it was an assistant secretary general. Turkey got that. Plus Anders-Fogh was sent, or he accepted an invitation, last-minute invitation, to go to a democracy conference, that is a bit ironic, in Istanbul, and then everything was set. But my point is that we've seen this so many times before. This is just one of many examples. And the other point, and this is a bit provocative perhaps, but I think that this is really the moral superpower that is coming back to hit us in Sweden. And I'm sorry that Finland is dragged on to this, and I'm very grateful for your patience with this. But the support of, and this was primarily, party politics. And of course, we can't expect other countries to separate party politics from governmental politics. And I think that the support for revolutionary regimes and movements that we've seen over many, many years. And I wrote a book with the title, the moral superpower. That was an ironic title. I don't think everybody got that. This I published that in '91. So I mean, this has been going on for quite some time, and I think that in a way this is coming back to us now. But it will be resolved, as was the appointment of Anders Fogh Rasmussen. It will be okay in the end, soon, I think.
Thank you. That sounds like a happy end for this part of the show. Everything will be all right. That makes us feel secure, considering the circumstances we are in. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much. An applaud.